Hello and welcome to Being Well. I'm Forrest, Hanson. If you're new to the show, thanks for joining us today. And if you've listened before, welcome back. This is the second of two episodes we're doing on the history, ideas, and influence of psychoanalysis. In the first part, we focused on the foundation of things, the trunk of the tree. This was Freud's original theories, the context that they emerged in, and some of the controversies around his work. And today, we're going to be talking about what came after. Psychoanalysis did not stop with Freud. Over the next century, it fractured into many different schools of thought, 100 branches, with immense influence on psychology, therapy, and the kind of mental health content that we consume online broadly. Some of these post-Freudian thinkers expanded on his ideas, others challenged them, but they all have something that I think we can learn a little bit from. Today, we're going to be walking through some of the major schools of psychoanalytic thought by focusing on particular prominent individuals, people like Alfred Adler, Melanie Klein, and James Hillman. As we do this, we'll be doing our best to keep things kind of practical here. I don't want this to feel like a graduate course. What are the important takeaways, and how can they help us live better lives? To help me do this, and I will certainly need help, I'm joined by clinical psychologist Dr. Erik Erikson. So, Dad, thanks for doing this with me again.
I'm psyched, and it is interesting that this, I'm not sure how many two-parters we've done about
Very
anything.
Few.
Yeah.
Ironically, one of them on psychological defenses. We had an episode on defenses and then one on dealing with other people's defenses that kind of emerged defenses. Naturally out of our recording. Right. Yeah. But not many. It's true. Very short.
Yeah. It just speaks to the fertile depths of psychoanalytic theory and practice that we are taking the time on it. And so anyway, I look forward to it. A little bit, this is like, to me, wandering in the wilderness. And the post-Freudians, I think of it a little bit. And psychoanalysis in general is like a murky swamp. Let's remember, of course, as the saying goes, no mud, no lotus. So out of that murky swamp of psychodynamic theory and practice, hopefully we'll be finding some flowers.
So before we get into it today, I did want to give a quick plug for a course of Rick's. He's got his Taking in the Good or Growing the Good course coming up. It goes live on August 30th. And I think that we actually have a promotional code. It's BeingWell25. If you sign up using that code, using the link that I've dropped into the description of today's podcast, you can get a 25% off discount. And it is a very cool offering of Rick's. If you check it out, I think that you'll like it. So, okay, psychoanalysis. What are we doing here today?
Why do we care?
Why do we care? What are we doing? I've separated these people out into what I'm calling three different schools. These are my terms. These are not formal terminology. Please do not take this to your therapist or something and talk about these things. I've just made this stuff up. But I think these are good, convenient groupings of people. First, we're going to be talking about the ego school. We're probably spending the most time there on Alfred Adler. Second, we're going to be talking about the more relational and developmental school. Most of the time there will be spent on Melanie Klein. And then the third school, which I'm loosely calling depth and meaning because I couldn't find a better thing to call it. It's essentially all of the kind of out there stuff that emerged from psychoanalytic thought. And we're probably going to spend most of our time on James Hillman. Neither of us is a professor of psychology. We're probably going to get some stuff wrong here. And we're focusing mostly on the key ideas, the practical takeaways, like what you can actually apply to your life from this stuff. We're going to be moving sort of quickly here. Ideally, I say that right now. Of course, by the second one, we'll be 40 minutes into the episode and we'll just be like, what have we done here? But I've actually got a stopwatch going in the background and trying to keep us sort of on track during this episode. Because it would be so easy for us to spend 30 minutes on each of these people. And instead, we're going to be trying to spend like 10 minutes on each of these people. So this is going to be very summary. But for me, the big takeaway or what I really learned from this work was just seeing the movement of these ideas through time and the different ways that we can interpret the idea of psychodynamics in general. And psychodynamics is just the notion that there are different kinds of forces at play inside of us, that we're not this kind of fixed system, we're an active set of forces. And the mind is not always in agreement with itself. And so part of what we're doing by going through some kind of a psychoanalytic process is we're trying to figure out what's going on, as you kind of mentioned there, Dad, in the more murkier depths of the mind, bring it into conscious awareness, and then use that to do something useful with our lives. So, okay, getting started here, starting with the ego and psychological defenses. So Freud focused on unconscious drives and the tension between those different competing aspects of mind. This school then took that idea and basically started asking, okay, great, it's cool that that's all going on inside of a person, but how are we reacting to the outside world? There's other stuff going on out there, and we need to respond to it in some kind of way. And the school was sort of loosely founded in 1911 when Alfred Adler broke away from Freud, in part due to Freud's focus on sexual drives, but also due to what he saw as kind of a grim approach to psychology in general in Freud's work. He was much more sort of future focused and optimistic in his approach, and he founded this branch that's generally referred to as individual psychology, although some people call it other things. Is there anything that when you were reading through my notes for this dad and kind of refreshing yourself on Adler that like stood out to you or that you wanted to mention, maybe even drawn from past history as a graduate student way back when?
Well, first I'd say, kind of building on the line that research is me search. In effect, we have these early pioneers, early spelunkers, going deep into the caverns of the mind and then crawling back out again and reporting on what they found, both in their own depths and in the depths of the people they were working with. So it's an historical fact that Freud was closer in age to his mother than his mother was close in age to his father. So Freud himself quite possibly had a fair amount of,
complicated psychology with regards to that. Let's put it that
relationship to his father and his mother. Okay, listeners can use this, and I'm going to be using it along the way as me search. Like, how does this apply to me? So I think that's an ongoing, really good thing to do. So the part about Adler that I thought was very cool was that he was taking Freud's description of the individual almost in isolation as a kind of victim or passenger of these primal instinctual processes slamming into societal and Victorian era rules. And Adler complicated it by locating the individual in a social frame and explored normal adaptations to that social frame as individuals start by being little small bodies that have to manage a sense maybe of inferiority. And then how do you gradually develop a healthy sense of worth? And also, how do you build up your own sense of identity as me in a complex relational world? I think on the whole, in most of the world of clinical psychology I'm aware of, certainly in America, there's not enough inclusion of Adler's approaches. It's just fantastic stuff, and it deserves more respect.
Totally. And the whole notion of the inferiority complex that we use all the time now comes from Adler. His basic idea, his kind of core insight about people was that we all start life feeling a little bit small. We're born as this vulnerable infant into a big, complicated world surrounded by powerful adults. And then we spend much of our lives trying to figure that out. We compensate for it, to use the idea of compensation, also from Adler's work, in a variety of different ways. Healthy development for Adler kind of looks like this. I start by feeling sort of small or inadequate. I then strive for significance in some kind of a way.
Yeah.
And then I express that growth by actually contributing to community. He had this, I think was a German word that I'm not going to attempt to pronounce here, that it basically loosely translates as social interest, which is a kind of sense of belonging and contribution. So the whole idea here is that we find meaning as an individual by contributing to something bigger than ourselves, right? So it's this much more sort of growth-oriented, future-focused, sort of aspirational model of development than what we see in more classic psychoanalysis with Freud, which, as we talked about in the previous episode, tended to take a much grimmer view of human nature.
Yeah. That is very hopeful and pragmatic. And it just feels more realistic, right?
Yeah.
I've plumbed my depths, frankly, and cannot find one molecule of an Oedipus complex. I can't. I'll be frank with you.
That's good to hear, Dad. And by the way, me too, which you will, I'm sure, be happy to know.
Oh, and your mom will too. But anyway, we'll just keep moving here. But the stuff that Adler's into, that showed up in his technique. as well.
Sure.
Right? He was more pragmatic. He was lowering the power dynamic between
mm-hmm.
the all-knowing analyst and the ignorant,
Yeah, he
foolish.
was one of the people who moved away from using the couch. He wanted the two chairs facing each other. Again, that much flatter power dynamic. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think also he foregrounded something that I've really come to appreciate, and I think is under foregrounded for people in general. Maybe we'll do an episode on this one. It's that Maslow gets at it a bit around self-actualization, but the framing there is very much about actualizing your own qualities and abilities for their own sake. And yeah, I think there is within us a really important need as social primates to contribute to the world, to contribute to others, to feel of value. And when people feel that their contributions are thwarted, or the love they would like to give is bottled up, or doesn't have an outlet, or is even shamed or punished. Digressing very briefly, I think one reason why adolescents in modern technical societies like in America are often quite troubled is that we thwart their natural movement toward contribution and finding value and their place in the world through genuine contributions that really matter.
There's been a lot of writing about this recently, focused on young men and boys in particular, and how we kind of set up these very classical roles for men over time in a lot of, in my opinion, very good and healthy ways. We kind of like broke those down, reorganized them, kind of flattened that power dynamic. But now maybe there isn't so much of like an obvious off-ramp for the guy who wants to be like a good family man or a contributor to society or whatever, but probably isn't going to go to college, or maybe just has fewer opportunities. Like, what does that guy do? How does that guy express himself in a healthy, contributive way? And, I think there are a lot of good answers to that question personally, but a lot of people certainly struggle with that. And it's a major issue for people these days. I think you're right.
Yeah. Adler was one of the first people to really normalize that longing to contribute, to be of worth, to matter. Right, including in terms of the social contextualizing of mattering. And so kind of as a takeaway, healthy striving is a good thing, aspiring without attachment, avoiding some of those pitfalls, but stay on the path. Just don't fall into the pit of getting really attached and grim about your results. And it's normal in terms of common humanity if you feel less than. I definitely have really grappled with feelings of inadequacy rooted all the way back to my childhood. And it helps to realize it's normal to feel this stuff, and help other people by receiving their contributions when it's appropriate, including their love when it's coming to you. What a beautiful service to them.
Yeah, I think those are great takeaways, Dad. And particularly just both for myself and for people, that notion of contribution and where does that contribution feel blocked in life, I think can be a great divining rod for figuring out where a place could be for a person to figure some stuff out, or to just like devote more energy, or how could I express this kind of effort or energy or desire in a different sort of way.
Beautiful. And be aware of doomed quests in which you're trying to grow corn in the Sahara, trying to grow roses in a parking lot. It's just not fertile ground.
Yeah, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, you're repeating a pattern maybe from your childhood and finally trying to get blood from the stone. But that stone is committed to not giving you blood. It just ain't going to happen. So sometimes you realize, wow, the fix is in. They're never going to promote me. They're never going to really value my contribution. They're never going to really see it or appreciate it. It's just not going to happen. And I need to look elsewhere. That's a takeaway sometimes too.
Absolutely. And for each of these people, I probably should have started Adler with this one. I should also mention when they were doing their work, because it helps you kind of situate it in time a little bit. He was born in 1870. He died in 1937. So this was total contemporary of Freud's early 1900s. The second person we're going to be talking about inside of the school is actually Freud's daughter, Anna Freud, who you could make a real argument, probably in my opinion, you can make a real argument, contributed more to the actual practice of therapy these days than her dad did, in terms of her work on particularly defense mechanisms. Major works in the 1930s. She wrote the book The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense, 1936. It is on the absolute short list of most influential books in the history of Western therapy. We've done episodes on psychological defenses, and we talk about them all the time on the podcast. So we're not going to go too deep here, in part because we've already talked about this stuff and you could refer to our previous episodes on it. But her really core insight was that the ego is not just this kind of beleaguered figure in between the id and the superego. That's sort of how we described it the last time that we talked about psychoanalysis. This kind of like overpowered entity that was just beset on all sides. It tries to overcome that position in a variety of different ways and protect itself from painful thoughts and feelings. And it does this by adopting a variety of defense strategies. You've probably already heard of a lot of these if you listen to this podcast: repression, denial, projection, rationalization, all of these words that people use kind of casually on Instagram to talk about psychology. Well, thank you, Anna Freud, by and large, for a lot of these, and particularly for the popularization of them. She did a lot of her work also with children. And so she was very interested in how the ego operates in kids in order to protect itself from kind of overwhelming emotional experiences that people could have earlier on in life. Really, really interesting work, and kind of moved the field from being hyper-focused on excavating unconscious material and like processing it out in different kinds of ways, and more to asking the question, how are we dealing with this stuff in real time? Like the ego is under attack. What does it do in response to that attack, like in the moment?
Their only mistake was not having their own podcast. Obviously, that would have been good.
Can you imagine? Just got a lot of recordings of the Freuds just chatting it out.
Oh, Forrest, with AI, we could probably do one of these pods.
Oh, geez.
Anyway, I remember a related version of Anna Freud's approach that I learned really from one of my key mentors, calling her out, Dr. Carla Clark. The basic notion is this, and you and I wrote about this in our book, Resilient. It's very normal for three things to happen in sequence very rapidly. What? First, some kind of natural, authentic expression of yourself arises, like a longing for something or an emotion or a viewpoint. And then second, the expectation of pain related to the expression of that aspect of you comes. And very often it's an expectation of pain based on your history, what you either experienced directly or observed or imagined. So now we have the expectation of pain, the second step. And then in the third step, we have the defense against that expression of who you really are, what you really want, what you really care about, which shuts down that expression to avoid the pain. It's the three legs of the triangular track. And so much of practice, as you and I have written about, is to become aware, often retroactively, of your doing laps around the triangular track and help yourself to become more able to tolerate the dreaded experience in the second leg of the triangular track. And as you increase in your tolerance of that second leg and your capacity to express yourself fully, then you gradually push back the bars on the invisible cage. And that is centrally engaged with what Anna Freud explored and taught about, which is an awareness of defensive processes and finding ways to serve their function, such as not being overwhelmed by certain feelings or acting in a world that's problematic. So we want to, it's helpful to serve the function of the defense, but in more nuanced, nimble, and adult kinds of ways.
Psychological defenses, as you're saying, Dad, they exist for reasons. They exist to protect us. They're not all bad, but they serve a purpose. They're trying to accomplish something. They're trying to keep us away from pain. They're trying to stop us from touching something that feels a little bit too hot. And there are aspects of that that can be good and useful, and we want to, appreciate our defenses in different kinds of ways, including if you're working with somebody or if you're even just like talking to a friend about this, you don't necessarily want to have a full frontal assault on how they're protecting themselves. But at some point, you do need to move to asking the question, do I want to be this way forever? And if the answer is no, well, at some point, you have to have a kind of confrontation with that defense, or you need to ask yourself the question, how can I accomplish this goal in a slightly more effective way?
And also just tip of the hat to her as a person. To have a dad as prominent as Freud, people say that the two probably central architects of modernity in Western civilization in the last nearly 300 years now are Darwin and Freud. I mean, we are all in biology. People are working within the frame that Darwin laid out within psychology. People are working very much in very often frames that Freud set out. And so here's Anna Freud stepping out of the influence of her father, propounding some things that basically undermined some of what he was saying. They certainly elaborated to it. And she worked with children too. She really pioneered that work with children, who also I personally have worked a lot with and I care a lot about. So tip of the hat to Anna Freud.
Yeah, totally. So third person, final person that I want to talk about inside of this kind of ego-focused school is Erik Erikson. And again, if you're a listener of the podcast, you've probably heard this name before. He lived from the early 1900s, 1902, until 1994. And he's most well known for this idea of stages of development. So in the previous episode, we talked a lot about Freud's focus on sexual development and the development of a kid over time. But he basically stopped that at about the age of 18-ish. You know, once you were an adult, Freud was like, you're kind of cooked. That's sort of it. And Erikson basically went, wait a second, what if it doesn't stop? And so he took Freud's focus on internal conflict and expanded it out into this very socially embedded and contextual developmental framework. And the basic idea of it was that the ego needs to adapt to face different kinds of real world challenges that we have. And so he broke those challenges out into 8 stages. This is one of those things where I feel like 8 was probably a borderline arbitrary number. He could have broken it out into 20 or into 5 or whatever. At some point, you just have to kind of choose a number. And he framed each of those stages around a kind of core conflict that we have to face. And how we navigate that core challenge represents this kind of fork in the road for us. We either are able to overcome it or we're not. And yes, through therapy and other practices, we can kind of go back in time and try to revisit that conflict in effective ways. But it does kind of dictate what we're carrying with us into the next phase of life. So maybe I should just name the stages real quick. The first one was trust versus mistrust. This happens in infancy. Second, autonomy versus shame or doubt. This is when a person is a toddler. Third, initiative versus guilt. This is about 3 to 5. Fourth, industry versus inferiority. That's 6 to 11. Fifth, identity versus role confusion. And the idea of the identity crisis actually comes from Erikson's work. That's 12 to 18. Intimacy versus isolation is the next one. That's adulthood, 18 to 40. And then generativity versus stagnation, which I'm sneaking up on and already feel myself being sucked into, 40 to 65. And then finally, Dad, this one's for you, integrity versus despair. And this is for seniors, people over the age of 65. So just kind of reading that back here and we talk about it, Dad, what comes to mind for you?
I love the work of Erikson. And you dropped into the background for this, some really interesting material about his history, which maybe we'll get to in a second, which contextualizes it here. I think he was brave to do what he did and to lay out these issues. Now, we can take them really literally, and many people have played around with stage theories of development. And
there are a million stage theories, yeah.
It's important to take them kind of loosely. And it's a little bit like your horoscope.
I agree.
See what fits for you. In your case, I think we could be a little personal here, right?
Sure.
I think you
okay. I wasn't expecting this. Go ahead, Dad. What are you thinking?
Well, the words, again, people can get really caught up in the words, like 18 to 40, intimacy versus isolation. Well, maybe that was an issue for you more toward 18 to 22, but mainly you've just had a phenomenal world of relationships, strikes me.
Sure.
And you've more grappled with generativity.
Yeah, even over that period of time, I would agree that the whole kind of like, how generative do you want to be? What contribution do you want to make? Some of the Adler stuff, actually, that we were talking about is sort of more relevant for me or more alive for me, even in my 30s than the kind of more intimacy question. With that, I mean, social relationships are important to everybody. I've definitely had moments where I felt more socially filled up than at other times in my life. I think that's true for everybody, but you're right. By and large, I've checked that box pretty well, which maybe speaks to what Erikson was talking about. I sort of checked it and then I could kind of move along to the next one to an extent.
And the notion here is that these are natural developmental challenges and we move through them. And sometimes in later in life, we realize, there's a kind of earlier developmental challenge that would have been really that needs tending to. I think that's true. For myself, I think generativity versus stagnation has been quite real, especially in my 20s and into my 30s, trying to find through my 40s, actually, 3 decades in which I was trying to find my way back into kind of the main current of the river of accomplishment that I had been sort of spun out into some backwaters.
When did you write Buddha's Brain Dead? I think I was at like 18, end of high schoolish for me.
Yeah, I was 50. So I think I was 55, 57.
I was going to say 2005, 2006, somewhere around there. Yeah, and this always kind of surprises people when I tell them that your first kind of, I mean, you wrote Mother Nurture before then, but Buddha's Brain is the one that kind of became a cult classic, sort of put you on the map as that kind of a content creator. Yeah. You were in mid-50s when that book came out, you know?
I know. Yeah, and I got licensed just before I turned 40, and then first book was published basically the year I turned 50. So there's hope. There's hope for late bloomers. There's hope for late bloomers. Yay, late bloomers. And rocking in the free world. It ain't dead yet. Still vertical. So, right?
It is often, people often do respond like quite hopefully and positively when I share that story about you, it's meaningful to them to hear, oh, this is still possible, or, oh, not done yet, in a bunch of different ways. Yeah.
They spent 30 years to become an overnight success. I mean, there's the truth to that.
Yeah.
So that whole thing and stagnation goes to, again, thwarted contribution. And that what are those forces that spin us into these backwaters and make it difficult to get out and get back into the mainstream?
A little bit about Erikson, maybe to give a little context on his work as well. He himself had a very complicated relationship with identity. So he grew up in Germany in the early 1900s. His mom was Jewish. His biological dad was Danish, but he never knew his father. He was born out of wedlock, and his mom, for kind of complicated reasons that I couldn't really totally get to the bottom of in my research on this, sort of left and fled to Germany, then took the person who became his stepfather. So it was kind of a new figure, but the stepfather was introduced to him as if he was his biological dad until Erikson was, I think, like a teenager, even late teenager. So as a kid, he was kind of bullied by some other kids for essentially being too Jewish, by others for not being Jewish enough. And he eventually fled to the United States in his 30s, where he abandoned his last name and took a new last name, Erikson. So this is a guy who was going through a lot developmentally over the course of his life. And again, research is research over and over again with these people. Development and questions of identity were a big problem for him, clearly. They were a central issue in his life. So that's kind of what he ended up focusing on. Just kind of makes sense.
With regarding Erikson's work about adult development, that, first of all, tension between generativity and stagnation, I think as soon as I use those words, I've used them with people in general, boom, it lands. People go,
people wake up.
Oh, yeah,
totally.
They relate to that. So that's one. Two, I'm minded of Daniel Levinson's work on adult development as well, which builds on Erikson's, and the broad notions of periods of construction, destruction, and reconstruction. In other words, where you are constructing a life structure of some kind, which then sometimes kind of falls apart as it gets reorganized, not so much destroyed, but reorganized into the next stage. So they're normal rhythms. And there's a wisdom in accepting the rhythms. I'm now accepting the rhythms that are normal developmental rhythms of aging and moving toward the last third or quarter, if I'm lucky, of my likely lifespan. How do you practice with that? What's appropriate for someone who's 72 is sometimes distinct from someone who's 22. And the challenges of someone who's 22 and 72. So finding your way into that, not so much relating it to the chronology, but roughly where you are developmentally. So to me, that's been a big, really takeaway. And the last stage is named in a very interesting way, despair.
Integrity versus despair. Yeah, totally.
By integrity, we're not talking about moral integrity. We're really talking about a sense of wholeness, acceptance, inclusion, reflection, and inner peace. And I think that's certainly appropriate for people as they move toward late middle age and beyond there. The last thing I'll say about stage theories in Erikson is grounded in new science on neuroplasticity. There really is an opportunity for all of us to keep growing and learning throughout our entire lifespan. I think about my dad, writing these statistical analyses of different bridge hands, in his 90s. What? Now, my dad was a weirdo.
We still use some of those to this day. Yes, totally.
Yeah. Anyway, but it doesn't have to be intellectual. There are all kinds of forms of growing and developing. I love people going into therapy in their 90s. I just think that's awesome, So the future is called the undiscovered country. The most important minute of our life is always the next one.
Great. And to expand that out to maybe a couple of takeaways or thoughts here about this ego school as a whole, these are three people who were very interested in how we manage different kinds of psychological challenge. So Adler focused on inadequacy. How do we respond to feeling small? On a Freud, how do we respond to feeling kind of overwhelmed by these unconscious forces inside of us? And then Erikson had those big life questions about identity and meaning. How do we respond to those, right? The point here is that the ego is doing something. It's not just sort of beset. It actually has the strength and capacity to manage those difficulties. And then the question is, how do we develop this thing that we call ego strength? How do we reinforce the ego's ability to make good choices, to do the things that bring us closer to what we want to accomplish in life, and to overcome these different kinds of challenges? Going from there into the second school we're going to be talking about today, I called this the relational and developmental school. The three people we're going to be focusing on are Melanie Klein, Winnicott, and Kohut. And these people all sort of moved the field or tilted it from a focus on the individual, that individual ego, and particularly how that ego adapts when it enters into conflict with the world around it, to asking, wait a second, there are some particular kinds of conflicts, or really particular kinds of relationships that shape the development of the ego. And they went, well, how do those relationships get kind of played out through life in different kinds of ways? Really focused by and large on primary caregiver relationships and how our earliest experiences get sort of played out over and over again through our life in different kinds of ways. The first person we're going to be talking about is Melanie Klein. She lived from 1882 to 1960, and her big idea was object relations or object relations theory. This is something you've mentioned on the podcast in the past, Dad. I know that you're quite into object relations, so I'm just going to let you kind of give a little summary here.
A classic book that's very lovely for anyone who's a therapist who hasn't read this is called The Interpersonal World of the Infant. There's a lot of beautiful material there, and then there's so much research that essentially we develop knowledge of the world in a frame in which there is a me over here, and then there's everything else over there, sort of. Now, the over there could be the ache in my tummy. Or the over there could be, the cup of milk I'm trying to hold, or the over there could be my father altogether, or the over there could be a group of people. And then it gets even more subtle. The over there could be a group of people in a particular setting. And we form models of reality that relate us over here with what's happening over there, and so forth. That's object relations. The over there are just objects. And it's a really useful model of different kinds of paradigms. Mm-hmm. And you realize, for example, that speaking of myself, if growing up you were really shy and dorky and you felt inadequate related to the cool kids are the objects over there. And then you start to remember, turbocharged by the negativity bias around negative memory involving other people when you're young. Those are the three big kinds of events that Mother Nature has really designed powerful safekeeping for in our memory systems, in locked boxes that are often kind of hard to pry open and need some maybe trauma therapy to do that. Anyway, there I was, with the objects, the cool kids. Now, 50 years later, I'm in situations where I'm in a conference and there are these semi-famous professors or psychologists there, and I'm just as famous as they are, actually, just factually. But inside, it's little Ricky all over again. Please, please let me into your group.
Totally.
And then I'm transferring, taking Freud's notion of transference, the client or patient to the analyst, broadening it out. I'm understandably generalizing into or transferring into settings today, these learned object relations patterns with associated feelings and desires and behavior patterns, right? That's an example. Now I'm kind of grown up and I'm pretty aware of this. And so you
can work with those feelings more effectively than you could when you were 12 years old, obviously, yes. But they still pop up, which is your point, that object is still floating around.
That would be an example. And so here we have Melanie Klein. I recommend reading some of her stuff because it's like you are in the jungle. You're in the primal, and she is your guide. And there's a kind of not an but like a wild, trippy quality.
So I want to talk about the wild, trippy quality because I thought that this was some of the coolest stuff.
Yeah.
So Klein in general, broadly considered one of the most influential psychologists, period. If you care about attachment theory, if you care about modern therapy's focus on developmental experiences, if you care about relationally focused psychoanalysis, you're in the world of Melanie Klein to an extent. So she worked predominantly with children and was one of the early developers of play therapy. Anna Freud also did quite a bit with play therapy. And her idea was that this is a more effective way than free association for a kid to access their unconscious material. You ask a kid to free associate, it doesn't really go very well. But you ask them to play, you can sort of observe them, see what's going on, and maybe uncover some of these kind of hidden dynamics. And she really focused on the primary caregiver relationship at this moment in time that was almost entirely kid and mom. And her theory is that we kind of internalize the people that we depend on. And over time, if we have a healthy relationship with that person, we internalize ourselves as being something that we can depend on, in part because we could depend on mom. We have this kind of healthy, internalized object that we take into ourselves in these different kinds of ways, right? But what happens if that goes poorly, right? And that then just carries into a lot of questions about developmental psychology. So wild stuff. Her idea, totally out there, but I think kind of true, is that babies start in what she called the paranoid schizoid position, which is crazy terminology, but just bear with me.
Let's just start with how we're all messed up to begin with.
Yeah, so we're all messed up to start out. We're all screwed up. Babies are paranoid and they're kind of schizoidal in their nature, which, by the way, kind of true if you've ever been around an infant.
No, you've never. When was the last time you've been around? I've been around a lot of infants.
I've been around a lot of babies, man. They are definitely a little paranoid. That's for sure.
What?
That's for sure. So what she thought, what Klein framed,
I'm going to tell your kid.
I'm going to attribute this to Klein now, Dad. You can argue with her.
If you ever have a kid, Forrest, when that kid grows up, I'm going to tell their kid, you know what your dad actually really thought about you?
That they were paranoid.
That you were like paranoid and schizoid.
So the basic idea is that, like, think about a little kid, right? They don't really understand what's happening. They're just reacting to what's happening. So mom leaves, kid gets scared, of course, because mom may never return, and that would be bad for kid. So like there's some understandable paranoia inside of the system, right? And her idea is that babies basically aren't psychologically sturdy enough to tolerate complexity. Their brain not ready for complexity. So what they have to do is separate things out into really clear black and white boxes. So they actually psychologically, in her concept, her theory, we can't prove this, but there's, some interesting demonstrations of this in different kinds of ways. They split the mom into two different figures. A good breast that gives them what they want, that feeds them, soothes them, nurtures them, supports them. And alternatively, a bad breast that frustrates and withholds, doesn't feed them when they're hungry, all of that. So there isn't like complicated mom that is an individual that does both of these things. They're actually kind of two different moms. This is what the infant does. So if the infant is hungry and the mom doesn't respond, anger is directed at that bad object. Now, over time, the infant, of course, grows up, and they realize that their mom is, in fact, both the good breast and the bad breast at the same time. The caregiver that they love and the one that has kind of made them suffer, in their mind at least, is actually the same person. And this then moves the child into the depressive position. So they experience grief and mixed feelings and complexity about the fact that their mom is both of these individuals. But this is actually a healthy part of development. And if the mom responds effectively to the infant while the infant is going through this kind of process, this is a good example of rupture and repair. The mom's able to kind of bear the psychological weight of the infant lashing out or crying or complaining or being just complicated and messy. And this leads to really good psychological complexity in the infant. They can start to hold different things in their mind at the same time. We get to do some shades of gray stuff in there. All of that becomes possible. But if the mom doesn't do that and doesn't respond effectively, well, these things are never really internalized inside of the infant, which can cause some problems for them down the road. So what do you think about this, Dad? Do you think that's a fair summary?
Keep going. That's fantastic. And, I think that, and what's the adult version of this?
Splitting is a major feature for starters of borderline personality disorder, BPD. That's one of the most common symptoms of it. And in adulthood, this kind of feature tends to show up as idealization and devaluation in a relationship. We've talked about that a lot on the podcast in the past. Emotional forms of black and white thinking toward other people or toward themselves. They are all good or all bad. I am all good. I am all bad. And what you can sometimes observe in people, if you're paying attention to it, is this pretty quick pendulation from all good to all bad. Around this arena of life, I am idealized. In this other moment, because I made a minor mistake, now I am a worthless being, And so therapeutically, often what happens is you have to really kind of work with a person through processes like DBT to hold different thoughts in the mind at the same time. Like both of these things can be true. And I think that's one of the big influences of Klein's work in general, just this appreciation of psychological complexity. And the ability to see, wait a moment, people contain multitudes. Like they are not either or, they are yes and it's kind of yes and all the time.
I want to really highlight several things you've said here in their immediate personal application.
Sure.
One, the movement that you named from idealization to devaluation. You can apply that toward others and you can apply that to yourselves. And very often what people will have is they will have split off parts of themselves that they are very ashamed of. They're really devaluing them. They're the bad.
Yeah, this kind of thing is super relevant for parts work. IFS, you kind of see the influence of it. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, exactly right. The bad parts. And so then often what people are caught up in is if they have a fragile, not yet really integrated sense of themselves as a whole, then interpersonally, they try to present their best parts with this ongoing fear that their bad parts will be revealed. And it can be fairly terrifying and devastating if those bad parts or feelings that are of inadequacy even and shame can be revealed. So then you get involved with defenses to hide the bad parts or to sometimes punish others who are trying to name your normal range bad parts, like, you kind of have a temper here. And this dynamic of idealization, devaluation can be applied externally as well as internally. And then the other thing that I think was really helpful in Klein and others is appreciating healthy ambivalence. I like my mom. Sometimes I don't like my mom, right? I can see my dad and their qualities, I think, could use some improvement alongside other qualities that are pretty okay, right? We see complexity, right? And to be able to expand the frame to see the full complexity of others is a remarkable developmental accomplishment.
Great takeaways for people. Only other thing that I would add here is appreciating those internalized objects. Like, what are you carrying around? What are those relationships like for you? What are particularly some of the ones that have a little extra weight these days? You don't even need to necessarily do anything about this. Just awareness of the presence of these kinds of objects that we've internalized and that are functioning as a kind of script for our behavior can already be so useful for people because you become more free. You become inherently more agentic when you're aware that this kind of thing is putting a sort of pressure on you. So that's the other thing that I would add from Klein's work. Next person that we wanted to talk about inside of this relational school, also talked about him a lot on the podcast already, Donald Winnicott. So this was 1896 to 1971. And he really focused on this idea of good enough parenting and sort of revealing a true self that exists inside of all of us. And his kind of core insight about people was that we become that true self through our early relationships, and particularly through early relationships that support emotional authenticity. And when these relationships don't do that, we adapt by creating a kind of false self that helps us perform in the way that we know that other people are going to respond positively to that performance. So one of the biggest episodes that we've ever done in terms of the number of people who've listened to it and watched it is on self-abandonment. If you care about self-abandonment, you care about Donald Winnicott's work. So he believed that what the infant needs isn't perfect parenting, but good enough parenting. A pretty responsive caregiver who paid attention to the baby's needs most of the time, and importantly, could really deal with their aggression and frustration without fleeing from them. He really focused on this thing that he called the holding environment. It was both literal holding and kind of metaphorical, emotional, psychological holding, where the caregiver could survive the child's distress. And if I think about the conversations that I've had with people, either in my personal life or on the podcast, about early experiences and traumatic experiences, particularly inside of family of origin, one of the most consistent ones is the feeling that their mom or their dad could not survive their distress as a kid. And so they had to perform a kind of adulthood. Now we have the term parentification for this kind of thing, in order to be appreciated on the one hand at the kind of the lowest rung, in order to be valued by the parent, but in more severe situations to just like feel like the parent would keep them around and not, mail them off to the orphanage or whatever it was. And so I do think that Winnicott was really incredibly onto something with the highlighting of that as just like a key aspect of development.
I love Winnicott. I love his voice and his writing. He's such a kindly person. It is an interesting question. Maybe when we're all done, I'll ask you, if, of all the people we've named, if you had to do 6 to 12 months of therapy with one of them, who would you pick?
Oh, well, I've got my answer, but I think that the second one would probably be either like, I don't know, it would probably be Adler. It would be my second one. Adler or Winnicott would probably be my second choice. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But I know who my first choice is. We'll do it at the end.
Okay. Well, we'll work that out. Maybe
Spoiler.
That'll be good.
Yeah, exactly.
Listeners should stick around, right, to the end of the episode, right? Who would we pick? Everything great about Winnicott. He was also technically innovative. He developed some methods with children in which they would take turns to draw a figure. They would each add a line and they would kind of co-create what was emerging there. And one of his, to me, interesting notions was the notion of the transitional object, in the in-between. Yeah. A space in young children and even in adults where we're kind of playing in our imagination with things that we know are not totally true, and yet they're partially true.
So this could be your favorite stuffed animal that you say is alive and like talks to you. Yeah.
And we can understand this as well with myth. Like just think about archetypes like a Gandalf or Obi-Wan Kenobi that are, coming into the culture. We know that that other person is not Luke Skywalker or Princess Leia, let's say, but they're kind of like that. And we're playing with that in that in-between space. And there's a way to which we can give ourselves kind of room to breathe. I think the imagination of many, many people these days is quite impoverished because our culture, we're seeing the 5th Marvel movie with Captain America. And, I kind of know that storyline really. And really, that's it? It's sort of an impoverished fantasy world. So that would be one. And then last, one of my favorite parts of Winnicott is to refer to the peekaboo games and hide and seek games that children love.
You love this quote. Yeah.
Yeah. And it also goes to something very, very deep in all of us. And it basically, Winnicott said that with regard to these peekaboo games and hide and seek games, it's a joy to be hidden and a disaster not to be found. We want to be found, right? Including our sweetest, most vulnerable, tender, fragile parts. And we want to know that we will not be left behind. What a terrifying thing in a hunter-gatherer band to be left behind because you're getting old or injured or frail. Oh, and when we're with another person, we really want to know, will you come looking for the inner me? Not just the physical me, but will you come looking for the innermost me? And if you don't understand what I'm saying, or you're not quite tracking, will you keep looking and inquiring? Not invasively or weirdly, but will you care enough to come looking for me? We want to feel that in others. And so I think a takeaway from that is to name that longing that's very normal. It's very natural. It goes all the way back to our earliest childhood and really back to our evolutionary history as a social species, to name it in yourself and to be willing to express it.
Yeah, and maybe to extend this a little bit, Dad, like, where do you feel real? Where do you feel like that maybe to torture this metaphor a little bit, in what ways have you looked for yourself, and in what ways have you not? And do you feel like you're putting on a kind of masked performance of that real person to some extent? I think that Winnicott's work is a lot about authenticity.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And about, how do we develop authenticity, and how is authenticity developed in a child? How do they feel safe enough to be authentic? And what are the kinds of conditions that support that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. To be interested in what's real over there, and to feel that you're in the presence of people who are interested in what's real in you.
So, third person inside of the school that we're going to be talking about, Heinz Kohut. This is 1913 to 1981, and he developed something called self-psychology, and he really focused on narcissism in particular. He was trained in classical psychoanalysis. He was a psychoanalyst, formal Freudian school, up until about the 1970s, and he wrote The Analysis of the Self in 1971. This is a big cornerstone of modern psychoanalytic thought. And he really kind of shifted the focus from the Freud internal drive states to more of a relational stance that focused on ideas of cohesion and mirroring. So how do we express our subjective sense of self? Kind of just like you were talking about there with Winnicott. We want to be found. How do we feel felt by other people? How are we found by other people inside of these different kinds of relationships? And one way that we do that is through what he called mirroring, which is basically what you're doing with me right now in the video. Give a little smile, you give a nod, you respond in some kind of a rational way. Do kids get that in childhood? Were those needs met for that person when they were very young? Or did they feel kind of invisible? We want to feel like we matter. And this doesn't just occur through resolving inner conflict, but by feeling like our inner life has been seen and affirmed by other people, much in the same way that you were talking about with Winnicott.
In my own training, I really like Kohut, and part of it is tone. His contemporary is Otto Kernberg. He didn't make your list. And by the way,
I had to cut somebody for time, otherwise we would have been here for several hours. Yeah, no, Kernberg was the last name that I cut. Yeah.
Okay, they were kind of in the same zone. Kernberg wrote something like pathological narcissism and borderline conditions. So he pointed to, as others have as well, the combination of unmet narcissistic needs and the development of borderline personality types and styles. And when I say the unmet narcissistic needs, I mean normal narcissistic needs, that when they're unmet, typically people then in adulthood either suppress those normal narcissistic needs for mirroring, validation, joining, and cherishing and prizing. They either tend to suppress them and deny them. Oh, I don't need that. Or they get very hungry around the meeting of those needs. I like Kohut a lot, and one of the, for me, most practical understandings from his work is to realize that he embedded this, as you've said, in a developmental model in which the infant is not able to maintain a healthy self in the broadest sense of person. So they internalize certain key aspects of the parent as self-objects. So it's an object, but it's part of the self. So the distinction is blurred. It's like the mitochondria in our actual cells. They kind of come in from the outside. They are their own lineage, but they're part of the cell. also. So self-objects. And then when those get internalized, that in a healthy way, then there's sort of a diffusion. They get integrated into the whole larger self that's developing. When that doesn't happen, then in adulthood, people are fragmented and they have a missing plug. There's some modules that are missing. So they go looking to others to get plugged in to their frame, their motherboard, to complete their sense of, healthy personness, right? And that's leads to often treating others as objects that are just plugins. And you know kind of what it feels like when you realize that you're just sort of a plug-in module, into someone's motherboard to enable them to maintain some kind of emotional equilibrium. You're a means to their ends. So Kohut really foregrounded some of those notions and laid out a path, because if the truth is there's some missing slots in your motherboard, you do need others in some ways to function, or aspects of others to function as an intermediate self-object, which is then your responsibility to internalize and integrate, so that over time you don't have almost a kind of addiction for others to serve that function for you. And he laid out that path really well. I thought that was great.
I think that's really well said, Dad. One other kind of final thing that I'll put here is that he eventually came to these ideas in part due to his work with narcissistic clients, or people who were presented as narcissistic, or that came to him and said, I've got an issue with narcissism, whatever it was, however they got in the room together. And rather than trying to kind of focus on them doing classic psychoanalytic work about drives and internal conflict and whatever, he tried something really novel. He tried empathic listening.
No.
Turned out it helped people. Yeah, how about that? And so what he sort of stumbled on was that these people were not neurotic in the Freudian sense of the word. They were fragile or grandiose, or they hadn't gotten their needs met, or they were kind of chronically empty and they were looking for a way to fill themselves up from the outside. And he then built this out into this whole set of theories about how does that fragile self develop and what can we do to, stop people from becoming more narcissistic in the first place. That then takes me to some maybe takeaways for Kohut. First, his reframing of narcissism was pretty radical. And this can help us get a little compassion and understanding for people who, not just people who are on like kind of the narcissism spectrum, but just people in general who've got some kind of maladaptive thing going on. This stuff comes from somewhere. The person probably doesn't want to be that way. Shit happened to them, man. And that whole stance is a very different way of relating to kind of difficult people. You also don't want to take it too far. Of course, don't just like excuse bad behavior just because like, oh, something bad happened to them when they were a kid. At the end of the day, bad behavior is bad behavior. But appreciating that complexity, again, going back to like the not splitting of it all, can be a really helpful takeaway from this.
How in the world do you connect Klein and Kohut in terms of the relational schools? What do you think are the key takeaways from the second group?
Yeah. I actually think there's a lot of similarity going on there in their own ways. They were both about complexity. If you think about Klein, it's about the development in different kinds of ways of internal complexity, and how do we like support that in kids? How do we support that development? How can parents be with their children in order to nurture them in that kind of a direction? In general, what I think this school all has in common is that we aren't born with everything that we need. Is that we don't pop out, as you say a lot, Dad. Kids are not tiny adults. They are their own unique little ecosystem beings. And we become ourselves in large part through our relationships with other people. The self is like shaped and supported and sometimes, not supported through those relationships. And that has consequences for people. And so we need to kind of reckon with that and reckon with our developmental history a little bit in a way that has become just enormously influential in psychology in general. The whole like school of developmental psychology, at least in part, comes out of these people and was heavily influenced by them.
Fantastic. And by the way, Forrest, I thought you had stumbled onto the structuring of these three clusters in terms of the overall trajectory of psychoanalysis, how it's evolved. But no, you came up with this yourself. I think that's great.
Yeah. This is just me vamping. So please do not take this for gospel. I'm just kind of loosely organizing people into different clusters.
It's a nice way to organize
thank you. Yeah, of related ideas and things like that. And these people have if you think about the things that we're talking about, even going back to the notion of splitting, you can kind of see aspects of psychological, like how do we create good psychological complexity in Winnicott's work and in Kohut's work and, some other people as well, Kernberg. Okay. So we've already been running for a while. We're going to run a little longer because we got to talk about the third group. And these are in some ways kind of the fun people to talk about because this is the most wild out there stuff. This is what I'm calling the depth and meaning group, ? Maybe.
It's like the X-Files, Forrest. What's the tagline? The truth is out there.
It's out there. Yeah, these people are trying to find it, man. Let me put it that way. So this is going to be Reich, Wilhelm Reich, the Neo-Jungians, which are just kind of a big group of people. Yeah. We're going to focus on one in particular, and then a little bit of Irvin Yalom at the end. So these are all people who took the psychoanalytic view of the mind. The mind is layered, it's complicated, there's all of this interesting stuff boiling around the unconscious in a very different direction. They were focused on myth and imagination and how does the body connect with this? And, what are these existential questions that we're dealing with? This was much more about what's the murky stuff that we can't quite wrap our hands around. Broadly, these are people who think that the work of therapy is not a checklist. The work of therapy is to connect with yourself on some kind of deep level. And maybe that means connecting with things that are even a little beyond that in different kinds of ways. So the first person we're going to talk about who's the most wild of them probably is Wilhelm Reich, 1897 to 1957. So he was a contemporary of Freud's. And he focused on these ideas of the body and character armor. He was a wild dude, very controversial guy. He wrote The Mass Psychology of Fascism in 1933. It's one of the most political pieces of writing in the history of psychology. And if you're like a body keeps the score person, Reich's work is sort of where somatic therapy starts, kind of, sort of. I don't know how many somatic therapists would love that connection. And he also had some totally wild ideas that actually ended up landing him in jail. He died in jail because he violated an FDA injunction against shipping what he called orgone accumulators, which were these pseudoscientific devices. They were kind of like modified Faraday cages that a person sat in that he thought like protected them or could like cure their cancer or something. Wild pseudoscientific stuff is also in the mix with Reich. But his core insight, which I actually think is very, very cool, is that repressed emotions have a kind of biological or physical toll on us. They're stored in the body in some kind of way. And we develop these defenses that he called character armor, these sort of modes of posture, way of holding ourselves. And by investigating the physical way that we hold ourselves, we can learn something about our deeper psychology. So is there anything from Reich that you want to comment on here, Dad?
I think that if Reich had offered his personal sense of energy, subtle energies, if Reich had just left it at that, like, hey, it's a possibility, I don't know. Or
if he had just sort of bowed in the direction of it and then returned to sort of the more somatic work, we would remember him very differently. Yeah, totally.
He wouldn't have died in jail, poor guy. Yeah. And the rest of his stuff is just, I think, great in terms of anticipating.
Pretty cool.
Antonio Damasio's notions, for example, of somatic markers, the embodied, the subtle ways in which musculoskeletal processes are, adjuncts to our overall emotional memory systems. Really true.
A lot of today's trauma-informed work kind of builds on his ideas that the residues of experiences are not purely psychological or purely mental. They have kind of a physical cost to us as well. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, a lot of mind-body approaches, psychosynthesis, Rolfing, Heller work, that get at the psyche through the body. You develop an intimacy with your own body that's quite something that's very granular and deep and worthy of respect. It takes courage too. And the people who are adept at these methods, as long as they, sort of stay inside some kind of reasonable framework.
Stay inside the scientific boundaries a little bit.
Yeah, or call it something different. It's okay. But anyway, there's a lot there. I'll just say that. Yeah, I think Reich, because of the wild stuff, tends to be tossed
Yeah.
out. You know, the baby gets tossed out with that bathwater.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that in, Dad. I think that that's fair. And I think you're right that, people, just like we're talking about in the previous school, right? People are complicated. And,
right.
We don't want to just lose the good stuff because they also had some stuff that was way out there. I think that in terms of takeaways for people, because I want to move kind of briskly here onto the Neo-Jungians, one of the things that I've really come to appreciate over time is just the obvious takeaway, but for some reason it's not always obvious to us in our practical experience. Guess what? We feel our emotions. All of these thoughts that we're having, all of these conceptualizations, all of these sort of emotional experiences, they are played out to some extent in our bodies and how we actually physically feel.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people, particularly for people who are more in the dissociative side of things or like soft alexithymia, things like that, they can sometimes get more direct contact with physical sensation than they can with somebody asking them, how do you feel right now?
Yeah.
How do you feel right now can be a really loaded question for a person for a whole bunch of different understandable reasons. But hey, how does your body feel can actually be a lot more accessible for them. And sometimes by exploring the sensation, we eventually pop out with the ability to actually understand the emotion that we're feeling alongside that sensation. And I think that you can kind of trace the line back to a lot of Reich's work.
You're exactly right. And 2 points here. First point is that even what you're saying there, like, what is your body feeling? The experience in the body is being mediated by language. So at least you're getting at what's going on in the body. Yay. A lot of Reichian therapies, and he was extremely innovative and very bold. And to locate it in the very stiff and uptight, late 40s and 1950s is really quite something to think about that time. And in that framework, he developed therapeutic methods that were highly expressive, in which often they would just bypass emotional material, verbal material altogether. So, for example, essentially, you might lie on a mat in Reichian therapy, and the therapist would encourage you to start voicing certain sounds, like oh, and then tune into what your body is kind of wanting to do around those sounds. Your body starts curling up, maybe going with it, exploring it, being highly expressive, loud if it comes to that. And definitely not your grandparents' mode of psychotherapy, let's say. And yet, very, very useful. So I want to acknowledge him, on a technical side in terms of expanding the scope of the tools that are potentially available to people, while remembering, as Jung pointed out, that the hotter the flame and the more explosive the material, the stronger that the crucible needs to be. So we need to make sure there's a good frame here. Primal screaming was a version of kind of Reichian type work in which probably the crucible was not actually strong enough. So that's point one. Point two, I do want to say, maybe I'm doing this because I'm at the last stage of my life and I'm trying to avoid despair. I do want to say that there's this weird mismatch between the primness and verbal controlness and properness and intellect, heavily conceptualness of most psychotherapeutic methods. There's like a disconnect between that and the wildness, the rawness, the intensity, the non-verbalness of most of what troubles people.
Well, you mentioned Jung earlier there, Dad, and now you're talking about the depths of the wildness. So we got to talk about the Neo-Jungians.
Okay. You're trying to control me. There you go. It's good. It's good. This is kind of a nod for people.
I'm trying to get us through this in less than 2 hours.
Yeah, in the therapy office. I mean, I got trained in the wildness, and I like the wild, right? But in the therapy room, you just often can't do it. I think it's appropriate for our field to have a certain modesty and self-inspection about, like I'm saying, the primness and.
Well, we're going to go in a decidedly unprim direction here, Dad. So your timing is perfect. Okay, so there was a major schism And we've actually in these 2 episodes barely talked about Jung, which with the benefit of hindsight, probably an oversight. We should probably do a Jung episode on some point. Jung's work is therapeutic and psychological. He had a tortured relationship with the medical establishment, with the scientific establishment, and with all of the things that you just mentioned, Dad. With like what's actually useful for a person. And can we get all of the useful stuff that exists for a person in terms of exploring their own psychology in this fairly narrow frame that we've established of therapy in the room between 2 people? The Neo-Jungians then took that questioning and some of his key insights and major focuses, like ideas about fundamental archetypes that are kind of boiling around this idea of the collective unconscious, how we all sort of share various themes in our psychology, even if 2 groups of people have never met each other, and also this idea of individuation, which is sort of how people become healthy people in Jung's conception. We've talked a little bit about these ideas in the past, particularly in the episode that we did on the shadow. So if you want to know more about Jung, we sort of covered it in that episode already. So these people then took the ball and ran with it, often in kind of wild directions. And they tended to focus on this symbolic mind. So these are dreams and fantasies and myths as a form of kind of psychological or self-expression. And in part, like Jung, they tend to have a lot of skepticism toward the classic Western medical model and the classic Western approach to therapy. They are less focused on pathology or symptoms at all, really, and more on almost like spiritual or existential goals. They talk about things like soul recovery. I mean, there's a lot of language in there that you would not necessarily expect to find in traditional Western therapy. We're going to focus on one guy, James Hillman, but there are a lot of other people that we can name. The name that people are probably the most familiar with, actually, I'm guessing, among our listeners, is Clarissa Pinkola Estes. She wrote Women Who Run with the Wolves, and she was a feminist analyst, did a lot of reframing of mythology through this kind of feminist lens. Also,
still
Robert
around,
Johnson. Yeah, she's still alive, yeah. The person we're going to be talking about, though, is James Hillman, 1926 to 2011. That's when he lived. And he had this idea called archetypal psychology. I really struggle to encapsulate Hillman's takes, in part because I kind of felt like he was a deliberate contrarian. He seemed like the sort of guy who did really want to be like stuck into a particular box and sort of escaped classification in his own way. And if I had to feebly try to wrap my hands around his core insight, it's basically, why are we trying to fix ourselves at all? Somewhere in there, our approach to psychology lost the parts of life that are about a kind of rich and symbolic interaction with mysterious things in different kinds. And Hillman thought that the psyche wanted to imagine itself, to express itself through our dreams and our desires. Our pathologies maybe are a piece of that, even these kind of mythic themes for people. And what would happen for a person if they viewed their life more through that lens, less as a kind of individual who is suffering and more as a kind of manifestation of an almost like cosmic theme about growth or change, kind of moving through time. And if you'll bear with me here for a second, I know this is getting a little fuzzy, so I'll try to give a concrete example, which is Hillman's relationship with depression. So to typical Western approaches to psychology, depression is a bad thing. The goal is to get the person not depressed. In some frameworks, psychiatry, the person has a chemical problem, so we're going to give them a chemical solution that's an antidepressant. But what if this is not a chemical problem, but not in fact a problem at all? And Hillman actually framed depression as this rational response to a world that includes a lot of ugliness. And he thought that, for example, depression could be a way for a person to connect more deeply with themselves, to retreat into a rich inner world that could contain a lot of interesting, vital stuff for them. And his sort of contrarian take on this, I think, is a good example of his contrarian takes broadly. And before I just totally swim out and lose myself here, Dad, is there anything that you want to contribute to this? Do you think I'm doing a fair representation of this?
You're doing a phenomenal job. I do have some familiarity with Hillman and his work and so on. And we're at the tail end of the run here, and you're still managing to, keep nailing it.
I'm trying to use what gas I have left in the tank. Yeah.
Go ahead. No, it's great. The thing I particularly took away from that whole territory, archetypal psychology, and bringing in Marie-Louise von Franz, whose work is really cool about fairy tales and looking into them. A detail, I actually ended up, I think, reading to you Peter Pan, and I had never read the actual book. And I was just startled by, as an adult, you can be very aware of this book written in the Victorian era, how saturated it is with references to sexuality, to primal processes. This Peter Pan, this seemingly childlike fairy tale, right? So fairy tale's really pretty great. The big takeaway is maybe expressed in Whitman's line, Walt Whitman, I am multitudes. Mm-hmm. We are each multitudes. And it's a way into parts work, if you will, of a kind. And to realize, wow, there are all these processes, and the Jung had the line that I think he called it, the archetypes are the images of the instincts, which is a way of understanding it. It was quite interesting that something deep within us, deep within our biology, is imagined, not by an entity, I, who's imagining it, but more like as a functional process in the psyche as it gradually bubbles into awareness through imagery of one kind or another that can often take forms. And to realize, hey, that's not a book you're reading. That's you. You are that jungle. Just that meta view, if you will, is actually really kind of cool and is a way into a profound acceptance. It's too big to control. You can't control the jungle. Maybe you can hack out a tiny clearing, sit in it next to your campfire and go, bad jungle, bad monkeys. But you cannot control the jungle. And there's an acceptance to that is available, through this Neo-Jungian material.
Yes. And my general take on Hillman and the Neo-Jungians in general is that they tend to be very focused on what feels to me like a kind of aesthetics. That, like, by engaging with poetry and image and archetype, it's very vibes-based. And I think that there's this kind of underlying current of different forms of art will sort of show us the way or connect us to something bigger and more meaningful for ourselves. I sort of struggle with that personally, because I think that the question is not so much what are we engaging with, but how are we engaging with it? Like, I don't think that poetry is inherently more artistic than football, because it's just about the kind of energy and intensity that you're bringing to your knowledge and understanding and interest in the thing that you're doing. Like, why are we when we think about famous mathematicians, we often talk about them like they're kind of artists. Like they're just finding like Euler or something, finding the beauty in mathematics. You'll hear people use phrases like that. Almost never refer to computer scientists that way. Why not? That's interesting. It's very vibe-based. Like, is that real or is that just our aesthetic?
Yeah.
And so that's my kind of personal, question mark about some of this. But I do appreciate the desire to include more and bring things into the room or bring things into our contemplation of who we are that maybe we've been leaving out in some kind of a way. And I think that the Neo-Jungians are really about that kind of what are we bringing in process.
Yeah, beautiful.
So, okay.
We've come very far here.
Come very far to the very end of this. And we're closing with somebody who is probably not even technically a psychoanalyst, but I wanted to include him in part because it sort of demonstrates how these ideas went on to influence other forms of therapy. And the last person I want to talk about was Irvin Yalom, was a professor at Stanford, is a current psychologist. He's still alive, born in 1931. And he created existential psychotherapy. Yalom's work is probably the most influential for me personally in terms of how I think about life or how I think about myself. And that's my answer to the question, who would I want to do a course of therapy with? He's not strictly speaking a part of the formal psychoanalytic lineage, which kind of goes from Freud to ego psychology to object relations to self-psychology. But existential psychotherapy has a lot of overlap. It's explicitly psychodynamic. It's very focused on unconscious processes. And there's a lot of focus on transference. And his core insight is that a lot of our distress in life comes from trauma, sure, relational wounds, sure, all very important, but also from a kind of confrontation with existential facts of life, particularly four that he pulled out: death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness. And these ultimate concerns that we have shape the unconscious, and people have to grapple with the existential anxiety that comes up in life when we start to face them. Many of our symptoms, or many of the things that we talk about on this podcast, obsession, depression, compulsion, these are all different kinds of defense against these deeper existential fears that a person might have. And it's a very interesting way of just thinking about therapy. And so, broad strokes here, Dad, I'm wondering, even just in talking about this, what kind of comes up for you?
I too would choose Irvin Yalom.
Hey, there we go.
And the reason is, in a way, I feel like his clinical stance, which reflects himself as a person, has the most embodiment of beginner's mind in it. You have the feeling that when you're talking with Yalom, that he doesn't assume he knows who you are. He doesn't assume he's got the secret blueprint to your psyche, and he's going to gradually reveal the blueprint to you. You have a feeling that he's sitting with you as he, like you, is confronting death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness, which for me, it's important to really kind of nuance.
That's the one you always struggle with a little bit, Dad, whenever we talk about existential psychotherapy.
Yeah, I think meaningless has a negative connotation in English, sure. But he really means without meaning, without inherent meaning. Yeah. And so you have to construct your own. Yeah, that's more neutral, but that's exactly right. So I would choose him in that way. I think that there is a tendency that we need to be aware of. Maybe now I'm stepping back as we really finish up here. We're talking about the giants in the field. They have contributed so much. And we could do another round, obviously, of modern psychotherapies and call out people like Carl Rogers and,
people we've had on the podcast.
Skinner, Steve Hayes, all kinds of other people, Dick Schwartz and others. And as giants, we need to reckon with their influence, because each one of them was in some ways transferring their own psychology into the theories they developed and the descriptions 100%. And explanations of other people.
If you take one thing from these two episodes, I hope it be all of this exists inside of a context. All of this is driven by external circumstances, the nature of the person, their own struggles, all of that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so I suspect that Irvin Yalom is preoccupied a lot with these unspoken fears of death, freedom, isolation, and lack of meaning.
He's written about this very openly, yeah.
Yeah, and some people really are preoccupied there. So I think it's important when we appreciate these people to keep realizing that their approach, these are not universals. And some of these approaches will fit some people better than they'll fit other people. That's the summary.
I totally agree with you. To do a couple of takeaways from Yalom here at the very end of this quite long episode, and thank you for sticking with us if you've been listening this long. I wanted to add him both because I'm a huge fan, and I am somebody who feels a certain grappling with these kinds of existential questions and issues, so maybe that's why his work sort of speaks to me. But also because I think that his work definitionally is some of the most contemporary of anybody on this list. He's still alive today. And I also think his work is just very contemporary in its tone. We're living in this moment in time of incredible existential anxiety, feelings of disconnection from other people, existential threat like climate change. Society kind of feels like it's falling apart, difficulty finding meaning and purpose, like you were talking about earlier in the episode, Dad. These are all things that people are really grappling with. His writing about aging and grief and death is beautiful and profound. And, I read his book, A Matter of Death and Life, recently, and it was, it's one of those books that I'll probably be thinking about for a long time. These are deep questions that we're living with. And I think it represents that kind of Neo-Jungian spirit of inclusion, of the stuff that we like don't quite understand and can't quite wrap our hands around. Uh, but for individuals, we can also appreciate how those deeper fears influence our behavior. Like what's motivating us to act in a certain way in this moment, right? You don't have to solve all of life's big questions to live a meaningful life, but acknowledging that these things influence you in some kind of a way is a really good way to start to come to terms with them and to not be somebody, frankly, who winds up on their deathbed having never thought about this. And I doubt that that would represent many of the people who listen to this podcast, but it is something to think about a little bit.
In a sense, you are yourself representing a certain wonderful quality in the work of, let's say, Irvin Yalom and therapists like him, in that you are on your own clear quest. And maybe that sense of the individual as on their own journey is foregrounded, let's say, in Hillman-esque and Neo-Jungian effort. I think kind of embedded in a lot of the early theories of Freud and maybe others is a sense of this brilliant magician of a therapist is putting a spell on them or waking them up from their spell, doing something to them. But your own just articulation there is how you approach the work of existential psychotherapy and these considerations really does emphasize how we're on a journey, and our journey is of worth in its own right.
Mm-hmm.
It's a path with heart, as Jack Kornfield put the title of his book. And I consider that those who are sincere guides on that journey, the counselors, the coaches, the religious teachers, and the licensed psychotherapists are engaged in something noble and even heroic sometimes. And it's a beautiful opportunity here to honor both some of the major guides in the history of psychotherapy in the last 100 years, particularly this kind of tree or with a trunk and many branches, psychotherapy, psychoanalytic psychotherapy, to honor them and to honor the people, first and foremost, who have engaged that journey themselves as clients along the way.
Thanks for doing this with me, Dad. I really appreciate you taking the time. This was a bear of an episode. I think it's going to end up being one of the longest ones we've ever done. And I appreciate you reflecting some of your graduate school experience, some of your own learning experience, your own long career in this whole thing, and just really appreciate you bringing that perspective to it.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you, Forrest.
I really loved today's conversation with Rick about the branching tree of psychoanalysis, where we went through and looked at what happened to that branch of therapy after Freud. We talked about 9 people in particular. This was a very long episode. I appreciate the people who stuck with us all the way through it. If you made it this far and you're watching on YouTube, you can leave a comment down below, asking a question, telling us how you felt about it. This was kind of a different sort of episode for us. And so when we do things like this that are a bit of a departure from the norm, it's really helpful to get a sense of whether or not people like it. Do you want us to do more super long form content like this in the future? Do you like the typical length of episode? Where does this kind of slot in for you? Because this was such a long episode, I'm going to try to recap it fairly efficiently. Otherwise, we're just going to be here forever. So I'm going to run through the people that we talked about and particularly focus on their key ideas and big takeaways for people. So we started with what I called the ego school. This was Alfred Adler, Anna Freud, and Erik Erikson. And these were all people who moved the focus of psychoanalysis from unconscious drives, that was Freud's primary work, to how the ego or the self protects itself, adapts, and evolves in response to outside challenges. And this group was really born when Alfred Adler broke away from Freud in, I believe it was 1911, if I'm remembering that correctly. And his core idea was that everybody starts life feeling a little small, and we spend much of our lives trying to prove that we're not. And we deal with these feelings of inferiority socially, and we try to heal them by contributing and connecting and becoming a part of something a little bigger than ourselves. Some of the big takeaways from Adler's work is, for starters, the whole notion of the inferiority complex comes from Adler, and we still use that all the time today. Then just generally the feeling of not being good enough or not being enough, period, drives so much of our psychology and our behavior in life. Healthy striving, which is the kind of antidote to that feeling of not enoughness, can be a really, really good thing, particularly when it allows you to express aspects of yourself that you feel like you've been kind of stymied around, like you've had to cut off this sort of energy because there hasn't been a place to express it. But the key is the healthy part. And this connects to a comment of Rick's where he talked about situations where you feel like you're trying to get blood from a stone. Knowing when it's time to move on so you can expend that energy in ways that is actually going to help you feel better about yourself is a key skill for people to develop. Then we talked about Anna Freud, and her core insight is that the ego tries to protect itself from painful thoughts and feelings by adopting various kinds of defensive strategies. You've probably heard of these defense mechanisms. They're things like projection and rationalization and even sublimation, which we didn't talk about very much, but it's when we channel our unacceptable impulses, that id material that we talked about during the first episode, into art or creativity or things that are actually useful forms of contribution to the world. And this then connects directly to our takeaways. Defenses are normal for people. Coping is normal for people. We all want to be able to cope in life. That is not a bad thing. The question is whether or not our coping is adaptive or maladaptive in nature. The problem with our defenses is that they're often different kinds of reality denial. We're trying to push reality away in order to feel more comfortable inside of ourselves. So developing an awareness around our defenses helps us move from this reality denial to reality acceptance, and then from reality acceptance to actually doing something about what's going on. Third, we talked about Erik Erikson and his stages of psychosocial development. And his core insight is that your identity is not fixed when you're 16 or 18 or 20. It keeps on developing over the course of your life. And different moments in life are going to have different kinds of core challenges that are associated with them. His most famous contribution is the idea of an identity crisis. Especially in adolescence, we go through periods where our previous roles no longer fit. And we have to kind of change our sense of who we are in order to adapt and keep on developing. We talked a lot during this section about generativity versus stagnation. That's his 40 to 65 age bracket conflict. But as Rick and I talked about, these kinds of developmental models or stage-based models of development are often a little fuzzy in nature, and you're drawing kind of arbitrary lines from one stage to the other. So it's best to kind of take them with a grain of salt. The takeaways here for people are, for starters, we never stop growing and changing. Age is just a number, to put it a certain kind of way. Rick didn't write his first really successful book until he was in his mid-50s. We talked about that a bit as well. And life has these natural ups and downs. It is normal for us to go through phases where things feel really hard. And just because things feel really hard right now doesn't mean that they won't feel better later. We then moved on to what I called the more relational or developmental school. This was Klein, Winnicott, and Kohut. And these were all people who moved the focus from how are we adapting to the outside world to how are we shaped by our early relationships. I think we spent the most time talking about Melanie Klein and her work on object relations. And this was the idea that we internalize people as objects, or what she called objects. These aren't necessarily literal objects. Your mother could be an object, as Rick gave an example of. Other cool kids at school could be an object. It's a group or a person or a thing that you have a kind of relationship with, and you understand yourself in part due to your relationship with that external object. And her idea is that from infancy onward, we build these internal representations of other people. That's what we call objects. And our relationships with these objects shape how we feel about both ourselves and the world around us. And this becomes the foundation for how we understand basically all of the relational stuff that matters in our lives: connection, trust, love, loss, identity, all of that good stuff. And these objects are not just the individual. They're the feelings and scripts and expectations that we've associated with them. We talked here a lot about splitting and how babies start in that paranoid schizoid position, then move to the depressive position, and how that allows them to internalize the feeling of complexity and how their mom is not, on one hand, split into kind of a good mother and a bad mother, but instead is actually just one complicated mother with a lot of different aspects, good parts, bad parts. And the baby has to exist in relationship with all of those aspects simultaneously. And how can we do that in life? That sounds like a really hard thing. Well, yes, but we have to do that because that's the way that life works. And if this process goes well, it becomes a great example of rupture and then repair. Something bad happens, but okay, how do we respond to it? How do we get back on the horse? Big takeaways here for people. First, our lives are shaped in large part by our early experiences. I don't want to be reductive about this. It's really easy when you bump into psychology content to feel like the only thing that mattered was your relationship with your mom or your dad when you were 6 years old. That is not the case. There's a lot of other stuff that matters. But it is true that those early relationships set a kind of template for us that we tend to return to over the course of our lives. Then also, second big takeaway, relate to others and to yourself as a complex, multifaceted being, good and flawed, well-meaning and frustrating. We're not all one thing or another. We then talked about Donald Winnicott and good enough parenting. I love Winnicott's work. I think it's so cool. And his core insight was that we become our true selves through early relationships that support our emotional authenticity. But when those relationships don't offer the safety and responsiveness and attunement that allows us to feel safe and connected to and seen by another person, we adapt by creating a false self that helps us maintain connection and avoid rejection. He had a big focus on the healthy development of true self. Something that I've mentioned on the podcast in the past is that self-abandonment or inauthenticity is something that appears when we feel like we have to trade our authenticity away in order to acquire safety. And man, you can look back over your life with that lens, and it can be very clarifying for some people. Big takeaways. Emotional and relational safety is not this kind of thing that people talk about on Instagram, okay? It is a fundamental need because it's what creates an environment where we can actually be ourselves. So this then brings us to the question, what kind of situations do you feel like you can actually be yourself in? How have you cultivated a kind of false self or a mask or a performance that gets in the way of you being who you truly are? This brought us to Kohut and self-psychology and healthy narcissism. Kohut kind of began within the ego psychology tradition, but he thought that this really left out people's subjective sense of self, their experience of being a whole and valued person. And his core insight was that we want to feel like we matter. This doesn't just occur through resolving inner conflict or dealing with these competing desires, as Freud talked about, but rather by having our inner life seen and affirmed by other people that we care about. He explored this through many of his ideas, maybe most prominently the idea of mirroring, which is the responsiveness of the parent to the child, particularly in a way that helps that child feel like they are really being seen and taken in, and even like the parent has a kind of delight in them. And then he really asked, well, what happens if a kid doesn't get that? And that took him to his work with narcissists, where he was working with these people who had narcissistic personality structures, and he didn't think these people were really that neurotic in the Freudian sense. Instead, he thought that they were kind of fragile and grandiose, and what really helped them was empathic listening. The takeaways from Kohut are, for starters, have a little sympathy, compassion, empathy for people who can be tough to be around, because a lot of the time they're tough to be around because they had tough experiences. This doesn't mean you've got to tolerate bad behavior. It's just something to kind of keep in mind. Again, people are complicated. We want to have a little bit of complexity in how we deal with other people. But then a big takeaway from Kohut is that healthy self-esteem requires supportive relationships. We don't do this on our own. It is not just about developing individual insight. At some point, you have to be reflected back to by other people in ways that help you feel good about yourself. So how are you getting that in your life? Where are you looking for it? Are you getting enough of it? Is this a major question for you, a major focus? Then we close the episode by kind of going out there and talking about Reich and Yalom and the Neo-Jungians. And these were by and large people who followed the more Jungian path of psychoanalysis and were very interested in deep questions about the nature of the soul and how do we live a meaningful life and all of the stuff that they thought was sort of left out of the more Western medical psychological tradition. We started by talking about Reich and character armor. Reich was a wild guy. He had a lot of pseudoscientific ideas. But as we talked about, in some ways, it was pretty regrettable that he went that far in that direction because so much of his work was actually really cool and interesting. And he would probably be remembered very differently if he had just stayed a little more within the lines. And his core insight is that repressed emotions aren't just hidden inside of the unconscious, they're carried by the body in some kind of a way. And the defenses that we develop to protect ourselves psychologically can become patterns of what he called character armor, different ways of holding our body that have some kind of a tie to our deeper psychological material. If you think about much of the trauma-informed work today, much of somatic therapy, you can trace lines between it and Reich's work, so there are a lot of takeaways there. And then for me, big takeaway is to pay attention to how you respond to thoughts or situations or people physically, as well as emotionally or intellectually. It's great to have a thought about something. Often when I'm working with people inside of a coaching context, I am much more interested in the feelings that they're having about it. Sometimes it's hard to get to feelings. You ask somebody, how do you feel about that? That can be a kind of penetrative question. And sometimes a way to get around that is by asking questions that are more focused on body sensations. Sometimes the body can be complicated for people. And for that kind of a person, maybe you don't want to do that so much. So there is a lot of complexity here. Then we went to the Neo-Jungians, and particularly we talked about Hillman. His core thought is that somewhere in there, psychology kind of lost the plot a little bit and lost its attachment to what really matters, which are these deeper core themes about life, like myth and legend and dreams and art and connection to something larger than ourselves. And we can kind of interpret our lives through those larger lenses in ways that are meaningful for us. I didn't share this quote during the episode because it was a long episode. We were just I felt like we were kind of running out of time. But there was this documentary that I saw when prepping for this called Kind of Blue. And he had this line about depression that I think really kind of encapsulates how the guy thought, and I'll just read it here. When we see our heroes going on TV, you don't see them lying down and taking a rest or yawning. Never. The manic condition is sometimes described in psychiatry as an absence of sadness. And the word sad is very interesting because it's connected to sated and satisfaction. So in Old English, to be sad was to be full. So there's a fullness in what is called loss or emptiness. There's something happening inside the melancholy. Now, do I think that a linguistic connection between the word sad and the word sated proves that there is something deep and meaningful in depression? No. No, I don't. I do not think that that is like a direct causative link, but it just sort of shows the worldview that this guy had and how he approached this kind of thinking about the mind and thinking about people. 2 takeaways from Hillman's work for people that, I'm going to try to make a little bit more practical. First, questions like, how do I fix this, can be very complicated. And for many people can be more helpful to ask a question along the lines of, like, what is this experience trying to say? Or what is this teaching me about myself? Or something like that. So you're removing the pathologizing aspect from the equation. Second big takeaway. For all of my questions and problems here with some of the stuff that Hillman was bringing to the table, there is this kind of noble feeling to his work that I really appreciate. He was trying to connect with something that felt bigger and deeper and more meaningful to him. This feeling that we're all just trying to make this thing called life work. And we're all sort of swept up in it, and a lot of it sucks, and we're just trying to do what we can. And maybe we're all just born along in this kind of deterministic way, replaying these epic stories over and over again. And hey, can we really blame somebody for playing their role in that story? Whether or not you agree with that, there can be a kind of dignity to witnessing yourself as a part of that. And I appreciate how he took things in that direction. Final person we talked about, Irvin Yalom, Existential Psychotherapy. I am a huge stan for Yalom. That probably came through in how we talked about it. I think existential psychotherapy is so cool. And it's not technically part of the psychoanalytic tree, but it's very psychodynamic in nature. And I just wanted to kind of connect the dots here from psychoanalysis to other forms of therapy that are practiced these days. Yalom's big insight was that much of our distress comes from this kind of existential confrontation that we have with life, and particularly with what he called these 4 ultimate concerns: death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness. I didn't actually talk about these during the body of the episode, but I'll expand on them a little bit here. First, death. This is the tension between the awareness of the inevitability of death and our wish to continue to go on living. Second, freedom. This is the clash between our confrontation with groundlessness and our wish for ground and structure. Third, isolation. No matter how close each of us become to another person, there remains this final unbridgeable gap. We enter existence alone. We exit it fundamentally alone. And then finally, meaninglessness. What absolute meaning does life have? If there is no preordained design for us, then each of us must construct our own meanings in life. Yet, can a meaning of one's own creation be sturdy enough to bear one's life? If those sounded like quotes, it's because they were. I took them from Existential Psychotherapy that was published in 1980. If you're watching the video, it's sitting on my desk behind me. I pulled it out for this episode. And Yalom really focused on existential anxiety as a kind of core driver of our suffering. And therefore, the confrontation with it is deeply meaningful for people. So takeaways, what are the deeper fears that lie beneath our behavior? What's motivating you to act in a certain kind of way? You don't need to fully solve this question. We may not figure out in this life what the big purpose of it all was or what really gave it meaning for us. But just engaging with the question at all can be really valuable for people. So we've come to the end. Very long episode. I really hope you enjoyed these 2 episodes that we did on psychoanalysis. This could have just been a total miss from us. Maybe people are not into this kind of content. I'm very curious to hear what everybody thought about this. Do you want us to do more episodes like this in the future? Do you never want to see this again? Did you have zero interest in this from the start? Did you think it was super cool? The numbers will tell the story, but also your comments really matter to us. Even if we're just serving a part of the population who listens to the show, but we're serving that part really well, I do want to do that from time to time. So if you enjoyed this, please let me know. If you made it this far and you somehow are not subscribed to the podcast, which I find incredibly unlikely, but hey, who knows? If you could leave a comment, subscribe down below. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe through the podcast player of choice. If you are listening, you can also find us on Patreon, patreon.com/beingwellpodcast. Costs, I think, $5 a month to get transcripts of each episode, $10 a month to get ad-free versions of everything that we do. We really appreciate it. Appreciate the support. It's part of what helps us keep on producing this content. Until next time, thanks so much for listening. I really appreciate it, and I'll talk to you soon.